Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on lessons from transforming the enterprise to an API platform. My name is Ryan. I'll be your facilitator for today's webinar, and I am joined by James Higginbotham, who will be walking through today's presentation. We're really excited about today's webinar. We do a lot of these sessions, and today is really a chance to bring in someone who has a great level of expertise and experience working with organizations. And we certainly hear a lot from the companies we work with here at SmartBear who want to hear from people who have firsthand experience and can share some lessons from some of the work that they do. I'm going to be leaving it to James to do more of a formal introduction of himself and his work. But I did want to just do a quick overview. Today's webinar is presented by the team here that works on the Swagger tools here at SmartBear. SmartBear has software quality tools across the whole software development lifecycle, and specifically in the API lifecycle. A tool like Swagger Hub was really built to make it easier for teams to collaborate on their API development, taking some of the best functionality of the open source Swagger tools and providing a collaborative, secure environment to design, document, develop APIs. Across the whole API lifecycle, SmartBear has solutions like Ready API, which allows you to also do functional performance testing, as well as Alert Site for our synthetic monitoring of your APIs. The Swagger Hub platform is used by over 100,000 users from over 40,000 organizations. And again, we really strive at making it easy for teams to work together and collaborate throughout the API lifecycle. If you're designing APIs, if you're developing APIs using the Open API specification or using any of the open source Swagger tools, Swagger is a platform that's really more geared towards teams to collaborate on their API development. And in Swagger Hub, you have the ability to have more secure, faster, standardized design, as we talked about the ability to collaborate and work on your team, and to really document your APIs and provide a great developer experience. Now, I wanted to provide that quick introduction because we know a lot of teams who are looking to really transform to an API platform will be looking for solutions to help that. But really today is about bringing in someone like James to really share his experience and to really talk firsthand about what he's worked through. So, that was just my quick introduction. I will be on the line monitoring questions as they come in, but I want to give as much time here for James to do his presentation. So, James, I'm going to pass over to you and we'll get started.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. We'll get this screen share going. All right. Well, good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to listen in to this discussion. As Ryan mentioned, I'm going to be talking about lessons from transforming the enterprise to an API platform. Just a brief introduction about myself, set a little bit of the context of where I'm coming from and what we'll be talking about. As Ryan mentioned, I'm an executive API consultant. That means really I focus on API strategy and program execution, typically within an enterprise IT program, but also work with some software as a service vendors. My experience spans across multiple verticals over the last 20 years of consulting. And most recently, I've been focused in the hospitality and banking industry. So we're going to focus in a lot on that. So just by way of a quick introduction about APIs, I want to just do a quick review for those that may not be as familiar with them. APIs, or application programming interface, is really just a contract between software developers. They typically drive integration, they expose data and business and technical capabilities through a programmatic interface. We see successful API programs that focus on value, reuse, and innovation as part of an overall enterprise strategy. Most enterprises are using HTTP as the common protocol for APIs since that's the language of the web. It works really well for mobile and web applications as well as internal integrations. And we're also seeing a move toward the Open API specification as a common format to capture the contract that your API exposes. It's also used as the artifact that's passed between teams, from the groups that provide the API to those that are consuming it, as well as drive internal automation and DevOps processes throughout the deployment pipeline. So at LaunchAny, we work with a lot of enterprises, as I mentioned, and we've been seeing a lot of enterprises start to migrate from an API program to an actual API platform. That platform journey is a challenging one, as it requires a lot more of a shift toward an external facing and an external focus than what we've had in the past, where we typically use APIs for more of an internal integration approach. So why would an enterprise want to build out an API platform to begin with? Well, most of their API programs and the API products that they release really just drive web and mobile applications. Those are the most common within the enterprise, but they typically just focus on system integration or powering applications like their mobile applications that they have in app stores. Platforms really create an ecosystem. They bridge the organization with their customers and their partners all together, empowering them to do much more than what they could have before just by providing APIs that power existing applications. A recent survey by Cloud Elements from a survey that was just recently released said that 36% of respondents stated that their primary motivation to become a platform provider was sparked by the desire to maintain stickiness. That is really just to prevent customer churn. They want to make sure that customers, once they integrate within that organization, remain there. And we see that as a pretty heavy driving force for a lot of enterprises. Their goal is to, once a customer starts using their API, continue to provide value to those customers, thereby preventing them from selecting another competitor as an alternative option for their API integrations. Now, when we think about an enterprise API platform, it generally represents a variety of APIs themselves. These APIs span a variety of different capabilities, both business and technical, across the enterprise. They expand the ability for internal developers to tap into those capabilities, as well as customers through web and mobile apps, as well as other devices. Third-party approved apps and partners are also another channel by which APIs may be accessed for the enterprise. And some enterprises are actually opening up their APIs to public app developers. They'll selectively expose certain APIs that they think will be beneficial to the overall development, overall developers, and as a result, allow public app developers to create new and interesting innovations on top of their APIs that they otherwise wouldn't have thought about doing internally. Now, what we've identified today and what we'll talk about today are 5 key steps that we're seeing enterprises taking to be able to move from an API program to an API platform. The first off is to develop a robust API program that supports the platform needs that are necessary. Without a robust API program, everything else will fall short. The second is to implement a federated API governance program to make sure that the quality of the platform continues as it grows. The third is to migrate to microservices to be able to have the agility necessary to compose that platform quickly. The fourth is to make sure that we have efficient API onboarding and adoption processes so that the platform can grow. And the fifth is to define platform processes overall that are used to accelerate and sustain the platform. So these are looking for things that will continue to grow that platform over time. So let's dive into the first one, developing an effective API program. Now, most enterprises, when they undergo this transformation, digital transformation process, generally start with an API program that focuses on one of these top 5 reasons. Most often, it's to accelerate their mobile strategy. They need a mobile application. They need to make those data and their internal services more accessible. But we're also seeing enterprises starting to adapt to the change in customer relationships, that those channels by which they communicate and work with and interact with customers are going beyond web and mobile. They're really now going to voice, chat, and a number of other areas. Third, they use them to transform their partner integrations. I've been involved with a number of different projects where we might have done integrations with EDI or other kinds of standards, or maybe we just integrate data via FTP batch processes. Those, while they work, can be very cumbersome to maintain and oftentimes require some sort of custom integration between the partner and the organization. So now we're seeing enterprises starting to develop a platform by which all of the partners can onboard and use their internal platform APIs exposed to these partners selectively to gain efficiency and free up internal resources by allowing the partners to integrate quickly and easily. The fourth is to foster technical and business innovation by allowing internal developers to be able to compose solution and innovate on top of existing APIs that already exist and the business capabilities that the organization offers. And then finally, we're seeing it to unsilo channels. A lot of organizations still continue to share databases either through replication means or by shared access to large-scale databases. And now we're seeing these APIs starting to break those walls of the silos down and allow organizations to access this data easily through APIs instead of directly through database sharing. Now, there are a number of different organizations and examples that are out there that have been using their API program to really drive one or more of these particular focuses or strategies. Capital One, about 2 years ago, released the Alexa skill for the Amazon Echo. This skill allows you to make credit card payments, check your account balance, and perform other things, all with your voice using the Amazon Echo devices. They've also released an intelligent assistant called Eno that allows you to text and interact with their systems. These convert text interactions via SMS into API calls that go look up the information that you've requested. Now, we've also seen in the hospitality space companies like Hilton that are using APIs to drive new innovative technologies. They have the digital key product now where you can check in online, receive a digital key, and use your Bluetooth communications features on your phone to access your room immediately without having to stop by the front desk. So it's important to understand a little about how we manage our API program and how we create an effective API program. And one of those very essential skills is to make sure that we manage our API portfolio completely. The first thing when we manage our API portfolio is to create a clear path for APIs to go from idea to production through the entire software development lifecycle. We need to be able to empower teams to contribute to the API portfolio. We also need to recognize that not all APIs are the same. Some are going to be available publicly for web and mobile integration, and some may be private or specifically targeted at partners. So we have to be able to manage our portfolio based on the scope of the API. We also need to enforce security. So we need to look at our APIs very carefully to make sure that the level of data that they're exposing is appropriate. We need to restrict access to portions of the API portfolio based on different roles. We need to enforce entitlements of data and access to that data. And we need to overall make sure that those that are consuming the API understand the full portfolio and how to find what they're looking for based on the context in which they're doing it. In addition, we have to drive adoption. To drive adoption, we need to make sure it's very easy to find what we're looking for and then onboard those developers that find a solution from the portfolio. Finally, we need to establish some key performance indicators or KPIs that define the quality of our API and of our overall API portfolio. We've seen a number of different KPIs used across different enterprises. So it's up to you to determine what, for your organization, defines a quality API within your API portfolio. Those enterprises that are failing to evaluate the quality and try to improve the quality of their overall portfolio experience a stagnation in the overall quality of their portfolio and the ability to get things done. Now, when we think about designing an overall API program with a focus on managing that portfolio, there's a few steps that we can take. The first one I've seen from enterprises that are executing at the top of their game is that they clearly define why the API program exists and what the objectives of that program are. There are a variety of different reasons why an enterprise may engage an API program itself. And so we need to make sure that we state that clearly, then document it and share it, oftentimes repeating it to remind everyone in the organization of what the purpose of the API program is, to keep people focused, to just kind of get it top of mind. The third thing they're doing is identifying change agents. Those that are really interested in APIs understand them and understand why they're really important. These change agents help share the vision to individual teams and other key influencers within the organization in the early stages of an API program. They then evangelize their existing and upcoming APIs as they release new ones as part of their portfolio. They don't rest on what the portfolio was yesterday. They look toward and begin to market those upcoming APIs to get people excited about what's coming down the pipeline. They also implement an effective API governance program, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. This is really key to ensuring that we have consistency across our APIs. They develop an API program, and they build shared knowledge as well. This enables teams to actually own the API design process and contribute to the overall program rather than keeping it just a few select people contributing to that platform. And then finally, they manage their API portfolio, as I mentioned before, but they manage the APIs themselves as products. They look at who the stakeholders are, and they design those APIs to facilitate those stakeholder needs. So now let's dive a little bit, as I mentioned, into the API governance process, because we're finding this is really fundamental to getting an API platform launched and to have an effective API program. Now, those of you that have been involved with enterprise IT for a while probably recall the SOAR governance days. Service-oriented architecture really drove a lot of the development of enterprises over the last 15 or 20 years or so, as we started to switch from database-driven systems over to distributed computing and SOA and APIs through specifications such as SOAP. And with that came governance that really was about rigidity. It was a very strict, heavy-handed enforcement of rules and processes, and the goal was to try to remove redundancies to prevent teams from building the same thing over and over again. However, today's modern API programs are really focused externally more than just internally. They're focused on driving revenue directly and indirectly, as well as improving efficiencies and in allowing for innovation on top of existing APIs that the organization offers. So today's API governance really isn't about this rigid, strict, heavy-handed enforcement. Rather, it's about encouraging consistency and offering flexibility to support the changing requirements of an ever-changing marketplace. So an effective API governance team in today's standards really looks to coach teams. They coach teams on enabling them to be self-sufficient by helping them to understand how to model and design APIs that will go into the overall API platform. They then share knowledge through educational material. They conduct training, and they offer articles, posts, videos, and other assets to help keep teams educated and understanding how to use the API platform successfully. In addition, they provide the means by which they empower solution teams to discover and consume existing APIs as part of the portfolio. The most effective API governance teams that I've seen are really just advocates for the solution teams that are going to be using the API. The standards of which they enforce are there to help the solution teams better integrate with the API effectively. Now, part of their role is to define clear API standards, select the protocols that are going to be used, and common design patterns or idioms that are going to be necessary to support the API needs of the organization. However, they do this to drive consistency, not to be heavy-handed and dictatorial. And finally, they craft flexible processes and practices that encourage innovation. And this is absolutely key. Having such a rigid standard that prevents APIs from having any kind of flexibility to be able to tackle new and emerging problems really defeats the purpose of today's API governance programs. Now, a lot of enterprises that we speak with typically start off with a centralized approach, but we're seeing those that are very large move to more of a federated governance model. So from a centralized approach, they build a team that ensures consistency across APIs, help gather up information from various teams, find those common practices that are useful for others, and then share that out with shared knowledge. Oftentimes, they may be the final line between a go and no-go decision for when an API is created and either absorbed or not absorbed into the overall API platform. However, having a centralized team can reduce throughput and limit creativity of the teams. A lot of the centralized groups, they don't understand the entire enterprise from end to end. They don't have the context of a variety of different business units or lines of business within an enterprise. So a lot of these larger scale organizations start off with a centralized team, but they're finding that if they move into a federated approach, they actually have a lot more to gain. What they do is they develop the centralized governance team that are responsible for creating standards and approving changes to those standards, as well as producing shared resources. The teams themselves define the APIs, and then they seek out coaches within their line of business that can bring both the context of that particular line of business alongside their understanding of the centralized set of standards. The result are a lot more whiteboard opportunities to sit down and work with teams that are producing APIs and help them bridge the gap between fitting the centralized standards that have been developed for the organization so that we have consistency within the platform, as well as focusing on ensuring that the context of the problem is actually applied to the design in an effective way. This is really a great fit for larger organizations or those that have distributed development shops around a particular country or around the world. We can have a centralized team that's dedicated to focusing on gathering up all of the intel from these federated coaches, as well as supporting these coaches by producing any kind of shared resources that are needed, while the coaches themselves apply all of the understanding of that particular team and the line of business they exist within to make sure that the APIs are designed well. Now, it's important to understand that not every organization's governance program is going to look the same. It's going to be up to you and your managers and your executive team to find that balance between having full control over everything that happens within the organization, but stifling creativity, innovation, and the velocity at which you need to deploy your APIs, with no control where it's Wild West, inconsistent, and very hard to understand what the portfolio does and how to work with one API versus another within your portfolio. So it's going to be up to your organization to find that balance. Now, the third thing we're seeing within enterprises is a migration to microservices. Just as a review, microservice architecture is really about a loosely coupled service-oriented architecture composed of these microservices. These microservices themselves are focused on delivering one and only one thing and doing it really well. They exist within a bounded context, and it allows these services to limit the cognitive load of the developers that work on them, because the code base is much smaller and the problem set that they solve is much smaller. Then they cooperatively work together to solve larger and larger problems. These services are independently deployable and generally requires a lot of automation to be able to go from idea to a service deployed into your test stage and production environments quickly and easily. The key advantage of having microservices, however, is because we have just one service that focuses on doing one thing well, and then we build those into a more composable solution, we can replace these services over time or experiment with different variants of them, do A/B testing, and really just try some different things within our portfolio. So for smaller organizations, sometimes microservices are a lot of overhead. To be able to break things into smaller distributed services and then try to pull those together into a solution can add a lot of extra work that some teams aren't ready for. So really what we see a microservice architecture as a fit for is for large organizations or those that have lots of disparate data that they need to make sense of and separate out and separate the management of it out, as well as highly complex systems. This is a diagram of a typical microservice architecture. What we recommend in large organizations that are using microservices is to focus on the API product here on the left in the green box. Those API products are going to be part of your portfolio, and those are the contracts you're going to expose to your internal developers, your partners, and or your public developers. Internally, you may decompose these products into smaller microservices, each of which may have their own APIs, manage their own database, and may conduct internal messaging back and forth across things like Kafka or some kind of message queue. The key here is that we have two different speeds at which our IT organization can operate. One is the slower, more methodical and consistent API product, where we have less change, less evolvability and experimentation, more consistency and reliability. And then we have a higher speed internally where we can operate much faster with different microservices. The key here is that our API products are stable and our microservices may change over time. As you can see from the diagram, anyone consuming the API product really doesn't know that there's microservices underneath the cover. Ideally, it's just an implementation detail that benefits your organization. The primary reason we're seeing a move to microservices is that constant battle between speed and safety within an IT organization. All organizations want to build software faster, and they're under pressure to do so. but speed increases the possibility of bugs and decreases reliability as well as safety. Are we implementing the proper security measures whenever we make a change, or have we allowed a security leak to occur? So therefore, a lot of times what we do is we start subdividing the work onto other teams and then having to coordinate between them. As we break our work down and we require other teams to finish our work, we slow down. Every time we have to have a meeting to stay in sync with other teams, we slow down. So the goal of microservices is to reduce coordination between those teams by decomposing the software into independently deployable and manageable services that expose one portion of a particular business's capabilities. Now, this is only true if we apply our proper software architectural principles. So oftentimes when we conduct microservice training, we review concepts such as high cohesion, loose coupling, and system design to make sure people understand how to find those boundaries between their modules and those remote boundaries between remote services. And again, just to reiterate, our public APIs define our contracts for our internal developers, partners, and maybe public developers as well if we have some. And then our microservices are an implementation detail. The other key is automation. I've seen organizations who fail to automate the individual deployment of microservices and instead march toward big bang deployments all composed of microservices. While that might be part of your journey and that's where you're at today, that shouldn't be where you're trying to strive to be if you're adopting microservices. The ideal state is to allow you to deploy microservices independently as needed, rather than having them be on some sort of larger agile cadence of a 2 to 4 week sprint. So to reiterate, a microservice architecture is primarily about reducing coordination costs, creating independence between teams while all of them are aligned towards solving complex problems and distributing or externalizing data and third-party systems. Just to talk about a brief case study that we had in the hospitality platform, there was a particular hotel chain worldwide whose IT department was comprised of a lot of in-house and third-party systems. They shared a lot of databases and they had a lot of limited knowledge about these systems. So anytime a solution needed access to a particular piece of data, they had to figure out which database they needed to go to. Then they had to find the person that understood which database tables and columns they needed to access. Obviously, this would slow down innovation quite a bit, really starved IT, and caused IT to fail to deliver on what business needed whenever they needed it. So instead, they decided to start with a microservice approach as they started developing a hospitality platform. They brought in some of these specialists that understood some of these different databases, built out the necessary capabilities as separate microservices, limiting the amount of knowledge that was required across all the different solutions that existed. They then developed platform APIs that were externalized from the organization either to other internal developers or to their partners. They used an API management layer to hide the details of the microservices and expose those APIs externally. Those were the contracts that they shared. They started this process with just a single team, and they designed and built out a single API, decomposing it into just a handful of microservices to get started. That allowed them to establish the overall infrastructure foundation before they started to scale it out. They've now achieved that, and they're expanding out to multiple teams. Each team has product owners that manages the roadmap for all of the APIs that are underneath their purview. And then the developers then in turn compose microservices, some of which are request response REST-based microservices, some of them which are asynchronous and respond to message brokers or Kafka topics. The fourth factor in moving to an API platform is about increasing the API platform adoption overall. Oftentimes when we think about API consumption, we just think about the browser or a mobile app sending and receiving requests across the internet or across a local LAN to their API. And oftentimes that's just as far as it gets whenever an enterprise platform initiative starts. But what we come to find out is that there's actually a number of steps required to get a developer onboarded and successfully using a particular API as part of your platform. Whether you have internal developers or external developers, it's absolutely critical to recognize each of these phases of the consumption process, what they mean, and how you're going to address those particular needs and risks at each stage. So the first step is that developers need to be able to discover the API capabilities that your platform offers. Then they need to map those capabilities over to their solution and make sure that the API provides all the necessary data and endpoints that are required to solve the problem they're trying to solve. They may, during that process, explore your API through prototypes, like try it out kind of features. Eventually onboarding onto the platform, gaining API access to some sort of test or stage or development environment, sandbox environment. They then actually start writing the real code, the production quality code that are going to be used to consume the API. Most enterprises find that they don't want to expose production access immediately. So they oftentimes have a checkpoint where they provide final approval before they give access to production. This is even common in some API suites like Stripe, where they require you to at least conduct one successful credit card transaction before they actually allow you to go into a production environment. And then once you're in production, you need to know, is your API up? How well is it working? We need to enforce rate limiting and throttling and proper usage techniques. We also have to keep communication with our consumers. So just because they've integrated with the API doesn't mean that we can just stop talking to them. We have to keep them updated on new enhancements that have come out, as well as improvements to existing API endpoints, particularly those that they're using, and whether there are some APIs in the platform that eventually may be sunset for a variety of reasons or replaced with other ones. This is why we highly recommend that a developer portal be implemented within an enterprise. Developer portals allow for one single location for developers to find everything they need. It helps them get started, understand how to use the API, understands how to go through the onboarding process to get an API token, and then provides code examples for common workflows and use cases that the API would be used. A lot of enterprises are really good at building reference documentation. JavaDoc is a great example for Java developers, where developers were taught to write documentation for their code. Well, similarly for the API, the documentation is the user interface for developers. So we have to make sure that they understand how to use the API effectively. Reference documentation is great to determine what endpoints exist and how to call them. But having higher level documentation like this with code examples and example workflows, details on how to get started, how authentication works, and so on, is absolutely essential to get someone up and running on an enterprise platform. Now, one thing we have noticed when we come in and evaluate API programs or platforms that are underway is that not every organization is at the same stage for their API adoption. Their maturity level for their adoption can vary from ad hoc, where they really don't have any kind of developer portal at all, to perhaps having a basic developer portal but lacking some of the key features that they need or key steps that they need to help get developers from the idea of what is this portal or platform all the way through actually consuming APIs. Once we have that, then an ideal goal to strive for is to try to achieve self-onboarding. So maybe in the early days, it requires a manual onboarding process just to try to limit the amount of people that are on the platform when you're first getting started, just because you may not have the resources to support everyone. But at some stage, the goal should be to allow people to onboard themselves, to get up and running with minimal or no guidance at all, other than some basic documentation on the portal. Give them access to a test or staging or dev environment. Ultimately, we want to cultivate an adoption process that encourages the community to give back, to share their own knowledge about how they use the APIs. So rather than depending on a bunch of tech writers that are there just to provide all of the developer portal documentation and walkthroughs and such, which is absolutely valuable, we also want to ask the community to share their expertise, their knowledge, and to help support as well. It's a very high level to achieve. It's something that you should be going for, but please understand that that's not necessarily out of the gate something that you're going to be able to have in place. It takes time and it takes maturity to get there. That's why we break this down into this maturity model to determine where an enterprise is at, where they need to be, and then what steps it's going to take to continue to rise up from level to level. Now, the final step in developing an API platform is to find those processes which accelerate the initiative itself. One of the things that we're seeing is that API platforms should not just be composed purely of request response APIs. We're seeing enterprise instead starting to extend their platform to include eventing or pub-sub, publish subscribe opportunities. This is sometimes through message streams internally, as well as webhooks, server-side events, and other technologies. These events and streams allow you to send push-based notifications outside your platform, enabling people, instead of just making API pull requests constantly to see if the state has changed, to be notified when state changes or key business events occur. The Cloud Elements survey that I discussed earlier actually had another really interesting fact. They said 40% of those surveyed responded that their apps did not support event-based frameworks. But it was the #1 answer when asked which API technology area was most in need of innovation. What that tells me is that 40% or 4 out of 10 of those surveyed realize that events are valuable, and they're just not there yet. They don't have support in there to both produce them and or consume them. Events are absolutely essential for platforms. It's what drove GitHub to be as powerful as they are today, because they use webhooks to be able to notify any other third-party system that has been given permission to receive notifications whenever there's been a new commit. That's created this amazing explosion in the CI/CD ecosystem, allowing third-party SaaS integrators to connect up to someone's enterprise or public GitHub repo. The other thing we're seeing is a move toward a product-driven approach. During their digital transformation initiatives and the idea of composing API programs, enterprises often fall into an API-first approach where they design their APIs before they do anything else. That's a powerful approach to take. But what that means is now APIs are becoming more like products. They're long-lived. They shouldn't be time-boxed. Therefore, they need dedicated product teams that own a roadmap, that listen to stakeholders, make adjustments and improvements to those APIs over time. They look for KPIs that help them understand how their APIs that they manage are being used and how they can improve the API usage. Organizations without a product-driven approach end up with an API program that contains a portfolio of APIs or an entire platform that becomes stale, anemic. They solved the problem one day in the past, but they're not solving today's problems because we failed to listen to what the stakeholders need today. Instead, we rest on what we heard yesterday and we stay there. The result of that are API consumers that find an API that just about matches their needs, but not quite, or doesn't comply with today's current standards or way of doing things within the enterprise. Instead, we need to start striving to building APIs that are product-driven, that have product owners, that constantly evolve and improve. One of our clients is a US bank. They have 10,000 developers across multiple cities, and they have embarked on an API platform from a top-down executive vision. That's a really powerful way to get something started. They started with just a few REST-based APIs inside their platform. They selected a few high-value areas, and they started delivering those. And as of today, they have thousands of APIs as part of their portfolio. Teams are constantly producing APIs that are reviewed by a federated governance program. As a result, they've had to deliver training, which we've helped with, to get consuming and producing API teams up to speed on how APIs work, how to work with HTTP, how to design and consume APIs successfully. We've helped them establish a federated governance program that allows each of their different business units to independently review and coach teams on API design prior to those APIs becoming part of the overall platform portfolio. But now they're undergoing a major cultural shift. They've shifted from a centralized digital product team that built SOAP services and brokered those and managed the consumption and development of them to productized teams that own APIs and message streams. As they've started to migrate this way, they're now seeing the need to keep teams cohesively together, to not move into a maintenance mode, because those maintenance developers have no context about why the API was originally built, nor understand the stakeholders that are using those APIs. Instead, teams that design APIs need to stay with them, and they need to apply a direct-to-consumer approach that enables them to support those APIs. This is a next logical step in the idea of the you build it, you own it process. Eliminating maintenance teams and enabling product teams that have product owners and focus on stakeholder needs to deliver APIs within the enterprise to support internal developers and partners, as well as public developers. The other thing that we're seeing is the need to apply cross-functional API training. APIs are thought of mostly as technology, but really they're an architectural level, but a business architectural level, in fact, not just a technical architectural level. They combine the idea of business and product with the technology that powers them to deliver a lot of value to the business. So therefore, when we conduct training, we need to have every kind of role that may be involved in an API in those training sessions. This spans developers and architects to QA, Scrum Masters, technical writers, product owners, product managers, and those in the business side. We take them through a comprehensive 1 to 2 day training program. And then we've developed even deeper program training for coaches that are federated within their particular line of business to help them understand how to review and coach APIs themselves. In addition, we have to look at how are we going to take this platform and get everyone involved, because it's not just going to happen within IT. We have to get security involved to make sure that the APIs being designed are that fit appropriately and deal with PII, MPI, GDPR, and other kinds of regulations. We have to create ownership at the platform level, where there's an overall roadmap for the platform. We have to have marketing and evangelism. We have to have teams that can support the onboarding of consumers and help them get up and running and write the code that's necessary to start using consuming those APIs. We also have to have infrastructure and DevOps in place to make sure the right network routing rules are in place, that we have all the resources to deploy APIs, and that we have everything we need for our message streams and asynchronous communication for our microservices. And then, of course, we have to deal with engineering. We have to actually apply common practices and patterns. We have to teach people how to actually write the code necessary to build resilient APIs as part of these platforms. And then finally, we need to integrate program management office, where they implement change management techniques to interlace the existing processes that exist today with these new processes that are going to be required to support platform, the platform initiative. So in summary, moving from IT-driven to a platform-driven approach is pretty complex. There's a lot here that we've talked about, and this just barely touches the surface. But some of the key factors involved: combining speed and safety so that you can deliver an API platform effectively at a higher rate of speed while making sure that you adhere to all the rules, regulations, and protection of personal data. We want to make sure that we deliver a consistent customer experience across all channels. So we have to make sure that we have a consistent series of APIs with consistent designs that expose the capabilities of our business. We have to make sure that we're aligning IT and business together rather than having them pointing fingers at each other, by making sure we talk to them. And we do that by treating APIs as digital products with stakeholders that listen to the business, that listen to IT and listen to external market forces. And then we look at federating rather than centralizing the management of our processes and our overall platform. To be able to achieve the speed that we need to break down those silos. We have to have a small centralized body that can define some basic standards for consistency, but then we need to be able to spread those coaching opportunities out to the edge of the organization. So with that, I'm going to pause, and with the remaining time that we have, I'm going to take any questions that we may have emerging from this talk.
Awesome. Thanks so much, James. And thank you everyone who's on the line. I know we covered a lot there, and it was great to kind of hear the session. And we did have a good amount of questions coming in. Before we start the questions, I just want everyone to know that I did just launch a poll within the webinar. We will be sending out some information following today's session, but if you're interested in hearing more about some of the different services that James and his team offer, or some of the different tools we talked about, we have that in there as an option. Feel free to fill it out if you'd like to. So James, I'm just going to hop into one of the first questions that I think came in a little bit earlier in the webinar. The question was really geared towards someone's talked about one of the biggest challenges their team faces is having so much data stored on legacy systems, and they were hoping maybe you could provide maybe examples or case studies or something that you've run into to help face this difficult challenge.
Sure. In fact, the hospitality case study I mentioned earlier is one of those. They had a number of different systems. Some of them were commercial off-the-shelf systems. Some of them were built internally. So they designed their API platform to match the target of where they wanted to be, their target architecture, their target set of overall portfolio capabilities. they then implemented those APIs using those existing systems. Sometimes they would directly integrate with those systems, but not all of those systems are able to deal with the scale at which we have to deal with at an API level from web and mobile. So some of what they did is they created local caches. These local caches contain the data for that system and they keep them synchronized using Kafka streams. So anytime there's a change in one of those other systems, the API tier was notified, and they'd have a local cache at the API tier to be able to service the high volume of traffic that they would have. That also gave them the opportunity to create a facade that matched where they wanted to be, kind of that target goal, while mapping that to the existing systems until they could slowly edge out that old system and replace it with a new system as they needed to get to that stage. So it gave them a lot of opportunity to effectively have a moment of redo, or an opportunity of redo, by using that API platform as a way to define that clear, concise set of capabilities and contracts that they were going to expose, and then map those behind the scenes until they could migrate to a new system.
Fantastic. Hopefully that touched on the question that came in. Again, if anyone's still, for the folks who are still here on the line, if you do have additional questions, I know we have a good amount here I'm working through from the webinar, but if there are some additional ones, do feel free to put them in. I did see some questions coming in about the recording of today's webinar. Just to confirm, we will be sending that out. One of the questions that came in earlier that someone was hoping you could touch on was around kind of documenting your microservice architecture. So it sounded like the challenges they were facing are, changes can be made internally that can cause issues, and they want a way of kind of having a way to document their kind of microservice architecture. Do you have any recommendations around that?
Sure. So one of the things that I would caveat this with, and I tried to emphasize heavily in the talk, was that the microservices themselves should not be exposed to others within the organization outside their own direct team, or that bounded context, some subset of the organization. Because microservices change often, our goal is to limit the exposure and therefore the coordination of when our microservices change. So when an organization has a microservices externalized, they should be externalized via a public or a contract, a public API contract. Now, when I say public, I don't necessarily mean outside the organization, but I mean that which you're exposing. That's the surface area of the platform itself. So it's a platform level API, and it should be hiding those microservices details underneath. In that case, then you would manage that contract of that API separately from how the microservice evolves over time. One thing that we do know is that as microservices start off, oftentimes enterprises start with a coarse-grained microservice. And then over time, they split those microservices into smaller ones. And the last thing that you want to have to do is go back to anyone consuming that microservice outside your immediate team and have to inform them that that code that they were calling before in the one microservice now exists in another one because you've split it. That's something that they shouldn't know about. Now, in regards to documenting microservices, for within a team, what we've seen is things like Confluence or other kinds of wiki-style documentation approaches being used in combination with things like the Open API specification or any of the Swagger tools from SmartBear or anything else that allows you to capture the API contract clearly for the team itself and to document those particular APIs. Now, the wikis are really handy in that they can be pointed to those various tools wherever the contracts exist. And they can also be used to capture the overall architecture of the different microservices and how they interact. So those that are familiar with domain-driven design know that we sometimes have context maps. Context maps will show our different domain models or domain objects and how they interact, what they're dependent on upstream, and who's dependent on them downstream. So utilize some sort of documentation within your team, but be sure you're only exposing platform-level API contracts externally, and you're not exposing all the details of your microservices. That will help you to reduce coordination and reduce the ripple effects when an API for a microservice changes.
Awesome. Thanks a ton. One of the questions that came in, you talked a lot about the importance of kind of internally kind of coaching and educating internally. I think you went into more detail later in the presentation, so you may have kind of already touched on this, but I think it is worth revisiting because we had a few questions earlier on what is your advice for kind of coaching internally? How do you kind of get people up to speed and really advocate some of the things that you're talking about in this presentation?
Yeah, the first thing is to have a very clear process by which someone can obtain a coach. If they're required to have to know someone who knows someone, then you've got to break down in the system to begin with. The other is that the coaches that you select, generally from a centralized governance program that are there to help other business units kind of get up to speed, always come from a perspective of assuming that people are trying to do the right thing. Develop the training curriculum and the coaching process by which you're there to help to improve them. If you're going to be there to tear down what they're doing, to tell them that everything they're doing is wrong, that's not really going to be helpful. And then be willing to be flexible. So find those people that are really good at teaching people, teaching others, and then pour into them the specifics about how the API standards are going to be executed, the processes are going to be executed, and then allow them to work side by side with people that are composing new solutions. Coach them, spend time coaching them through, asking them questions, and then encourage them to show the consumption side of a particular API. So when you're designing an API, sometimes we forget to look at the consumption side. So coach them on taking the consumer's point of view and looking at their API designs from an outside perspective, and oftentimes shed light on issues that might end up making the platform a little bit harder to conduct. But it is important to find the right people to conduct it, and it's also important to develop a program with a process around the coaching so that it's easy to manage all of the requests that come in, take them one at a time, and make sure that they're each given the amount of time that they need. As you're going through and building a coaching program, then look for those standouts and let those be extensions to the overall governance program. And sometimes putting like a little trifold cardboard indicator or some kind of sign or something that says they're an API coach can attract the attention of those around them on site inside their building, and they can reach out and go through the process of obtaining coaching. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we've had a couple questions come in. I think you showed earlier kind of example of like an API developer portal and the role that plays in API documentation. Someone asked specifically about Swagger Hub. So for anyone who's online, Swagger Hub itself isn't really, we don't cater to a full API development portal in the way in some of the examples that I think James was showing. And so while it can certainly help in that regard in publishing your documentation, I think for people who are looking for maybe a more full-scale, API development portal, do you have recommendations of different tooling offerings, whether they're commercial or open source tools that are out there that teams could look at?
Sure. The biggest thing that I've seen that works well is using a static site generator. Most of them are open source. The one that I showed the picture of in the diagram is based on Jekyll, and it's actually a template that I make available in my GitHub repository. So if you just go to github.com/LaunchAny, I believe that's the URL, just look for the LaunchAny user ID on GitHub. You'll see the MVD or minimum viable documentation template that we created. It's based on Jekyll and helps people get started. So you can take all of your open API specifications inside of Swagger Hub and then publish them through that using like the Swagger UI tool or some other tool, as well as use this to craft up markdown documentation to get some of those preliminary onboarding documentation pages up and running easily. And then you can integrate that in with whatever tool you use to manage the life cycle of your API definitions.
Cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. Great to hear. We just had a question come in from Wesley. Wesley's asking about kind of introducing breaking API changes for external consumers. I think concern there is, how do you present going from V1, V2, V3 in a relatively short amount of time? Any suggestions around that?
So I've written a little bit about that on a site, an API management layer site called Tyke. I've talked a lot about, that's TYK. I've spoken a lot about the API versioning process. I think the key thing is there's a difference between versioning before you release and versioning after. So if you're in a hyper-focused, constant state of flux as you're working out a particular API, then you should probably limit the exposure of that API to the people that you're directly helping to get onboarded with that API. You probably have certain stakeholders that you're working with. So communicating with them may be a little bit easier than communicating with the general public about API changes. But the key thing to understand is if you make a breaking change to an API, you're forcing people to jump to a new product, and that's a chance for someone to jump off your API. So you have to be very, very careful about it. I wrote about modeling and design techniques to help find those API designs early to try to limit the thrash in my book, A Practical Approach to API Design, which you can get at theapidesignbook.com. And that's a great technique to be able to surface those requirements early so that we're not just focused on taking data from a database, exposing them, and realize that doesn't work. Instead, we kind of take an outside-in approach to looking at what's trying to be done and what's needed inside the API design. Then we can try to hit that. But API versioning can happen sometimes. In that case, separate the API lifecycle of your API from being fully released to maybe like a beta release. And in that beta, have the caveat that if you're adopting this API, it may change over time to meet the needs of our stakeholders as we refine the API design and build that into your overall lifecycle. That will help some and reduce some of the thrash overall.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. I think we have time for at least one more question here. So, someone was asking again, you're talking about, internally kind of building out different teams. The question was, in terms of building out these teams to support and building an API program, would you say that you need different teams driving different aspects of this program? For example, a team for governance or a team for overall API design? How do you build these teams within an org that already has an established set of APIs, but maybe needs a more structured approach?
Sure. I think you definitely need to bring people with different skill sets. Some of them will be skill sets that involved evangelism or marketing or support. So having solution architects that know how to take the APIs and compose solutions would be useful to have them involved and to get them supporting teams that are trying to use the API platform. You need to establish a governance program, as I mentioned, and that governance program, you need to determine the scope of it. Some of them belong within, say, a center of excellence or an API council or some sort of group that specializes in bringing all these different aspects together, and they oversee the overall platform, but then they have teams within them that are specialized to deal with different aspects of the program itself and execution. So I think the key thing is establish what kind of surface area you have for your API now, determine where your weaknesses are. Is it in gaining adoption? Is it in support? Where is it at? And then start to establish teams that have the skills necessary to go forward. How it looks inside of each enterprise really does vary based on their internal culture. Sometimes they centralize it with one group. Sometimes they actually have different groups that are sort of peers of one another that as a whole comprise the entire API program or platform initiative. So it may depend on your culture, but first of all, identify those that are really passionate about APIs, figure out how they can help, and then conduct a gap analysis to figure out where they can jump in and fill those gaps and address those holes. And then over time, you'll start to see a structure emerge and determine, is it one centralized group or is it a series of different groups that are cooperatively working together? In one case, I've seen those different groups work together and you selectively pick one or two representatives from each one to meet into, say, like a council meeting monthly, maybe more often in the beginning, to allow all of them to bring up and raise issues that are emerging so that they can then get those issues resolved, work out all the details about the processes and improvements that need to take place. And then maybe they just meet once a month after some period of time once things start to settle. Other organizations, it's centralized, so it does vary.
Great. Thanks so much, James. I know we're through a couple of rapid fire questions at you there. I want to be conscious of people's schedules, so I do think we need to wrap up now. I want to say thanks again to James for kind of answering all of these questions and for this fantastic presentation. James, I'd love to give you just a chance to kind of just let people know kind of where they can find you. We will be sharing a recording on this webinar and probably following up some additional information, but where can people find you and learn more about kind of what your team offers?
Absolutely. So you can find us on our website at launchany.com. It's on your screen as well on the slide. You can find me on Twitter at LaunchAny. And then we actually have a weekly newsletter that we release every Thursday. So if you want to just keep up to date on the happenings within the API space, just go to apideveloperweekly.com and throw in your email address. We usually post everything about Thursday noon Central Time is when everything is published. So you'll just get a bunch of different links that are hand curated on what's going on in the API space.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, again, for this webinar, James, I'd like to say thank you one last time. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. If you did join late today, we are going to be doing another session in just a few hours, around 2 p.m. Eastern time, if you wanted to join that session. But for now, we're going to sign off. James, thanks again, and thanks everyone who tuned in today.
Thank you, Ryan.